Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, I can hear you.
Thank God.
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay. So we've got about an hour, is that right? We've got about an hour.
Start our talk today, being conscious of time. And it's really our pleasure to have the former governor of Hong Kong, Chris Patten, Lord Chris Patten, to join us online to talk to us about his recently published Hong Kong Diaries, which the Chinese version was just released. So, as a group of people who are very concerned with the development of Hong Kong's democracy, we are gathering today with a group of concerned people for these publication of these Hong Kong diaries. We are also honored today to have four panelists with us today. We have a writer Ping Lu, and also a senior journalist Li Zhide, and also the director and chairperson of Taiwan Hong Kong Association, Mr. Sang Pu, and also Mr. Lai Yizhong, who is the former director of Taiwan think tank. So this is how we are going to proceed today. First, we will give the floor to Lord Chris Patten to talk about 10 minutes about his Hong Kong diaries. And then we also have four questions prepared. We would like to invite Sir Lord Chris Patten to answer these questions together with our four panelists. So our Taiwanese panelists here with us will also give comments and feedback to Sir Patton's comments. So we will try our best to manage our time well. So all of our panelists will have some time for QA, and also we can take questions from the floor. Therefore, in the interest of time, without further ado, we have a lot of special guests today gathering here today with a group of friends who are very concerned about Hong Kong's development and future. And we also have politician Mr. Zhou Yicheng here with us, and Liao Zhifeng, the chief editor, and also writer Lu Yujia, and also columnist, and also Mr. Gu Wede, and Mr. Song Cheng'en, and Mr. Hu Chang'an, and also Mr. Liang Guogan, and also director Guo Yuren are here with us today, and Mr. Li Mingzhe, Cai Zhu'er, and Huang Huijun, Chen Rongbin, and also Mr. Xu Jiayu. So we have a lineup of journalists and celebrities who are very concerned about the future of Hong Kong here with us today. So we have a little bit of time. Therefore, before we start, I would like to talk a little bit about Hong Kong Diaries, which was written during the time of 1992 to 1997, documenting his journey as the last governor of Hong Kong. And we actually saw this is actually a work that offers a very insightful information, giving us an outline of the handover preparation process between Hong Kong government and also China and British government. And he also shared about all his efforts going into establishing, paving the foundation for Hong Kong, paving the way for democracy and liberty for Hong Kong. And he is, of course, a very influential figure, allowing many Hong Kongers to really pave a good way for handing over, allowing Zheng Lingquan and like Anson Chen, these prominent figures can still take up important positions in the government of Hong Kong. Of course, he established a good foundation for Hong Kong's market economy. For example, lots of infrastructure were put in place for economy and also transportation. Of course, the new airport of Hong Kong was one of his big contributions to Hong Kong. And of course, these have contributions is also contest ground between Mr. Chris Patten and CCP. Of course, they put a lot of obstacles for Lord Chris Patten for his work. So I think later on we are going to hear more about that from Lord Patten. And in Taiwan, and he is he is now serving on the board of directors of Oxford, and he used to serve on positions of board of directors for Newcastle University, and he used to also be the party leader of Conservative Party of UK. So I believe you're very familiar with Lord Chris Patten, and I believe that for all of us, he's a household name, and during that handover transition period, I believe that he has built a very tight and close connections with Hong Kong people. I believe that he will have a lot of touching stories and anecdotes to share with us later on about what happened between his term as the governor of Hong Kong and Hong Kong people. So marking the handover of Hong Kong into the 2 decades, and we are actually seeing lots of very concerning development in Hong Kong. So now we are here because we are very concerned about the future of Hong Kong. Again, we would like to express our gratitude to Mr. Patton for dialing in with us. So it's actually 6:09 in the morning in London. So we can make the most of our time today to have a good exchange with him. So I think I will just stop here And now I would just like to give the floor to Lord Patton, and maybe I would like to now invite Lord Patton to wave your hand to our audience right here.
他跟现场的各位正在回。
So he just waved to our audience here in the room. So I think my first more general question to you is that what motivated you to publish your diaries while you were the governor of Hong Kong? Why did you want to write and publish this book at the very beginning?
Let me first of all say what a great pleasure it is to address a conference in Taiwan. I have only been able to visit Taiwan once in my life when I published a book about my experiences as Hong Kong governor called East and West. But I was well aware of the fact that I was visiting a society which combined some of the best of the East and the West, and which had a genuine, rumbustious democracy and open society, and was also one of the strongest educational and technical societies on the planet. We have a number of students from Taiwan at Oxford University, where I'm the Chancellor, and they make a valuable contribution to our academic community. I just want to make two other things before saying a word or two in response to your question. This isn't my first experience, of course, of encountering Taiwan. The first was when I was Britain's Overseas Development Minister, and in 1989, because of my ministerial responsibilities, was for a year the Vice Chairman of the Asia Development Bank. And that year, the Asia Development Bank annual meeting was held in Beijing. And it was thought that the main issue of interest was going to be the seating of Taiwan Taipei in that meeting. Of course, it turned out to be very different. First of all, there was the visit of Mr. Gorbachev to Beijing, but above all, there were the students' demonstrations and meetings in Tiananmen Square in support of democracy and freedom, all the sort of values which Taiwan reflects so well. So my first experience was that in Beijing. I left Beijing just before the murders in Tiananmen Square by the People's Liberation Army. And it's something which until recently used to be remembered in Hong Kong, both through a museum and through the annual vigil and the church services which people held in memory of those who'd been killed. Secondly, when I was the European Commissioner from 1999 to 2004, I had the responsibility of announcing the opening of a European office in Taipei to take account of the responsibilities shared between Europe and Taiwan of Taiwan's membership of the WTO. So I'm not a stranger to what happens in Taiwan, and I now view with interest the extraordinary high-tech progress made in Taiwan, which is one of the reflections of the fact that Taiwan is a free society, as Hong Kong once was. Now, cut to the quick. Let me give a brief outline of why I wrote these diaries, or published diaries that I'd been writing night after night, week after week when I was governor of Hong Kong. Hong Kong was not like other British colonies. We wouldn't today try to justify colonialism. The only real colonial power now is, of course, the People's Republic of China, which still acts like, in many respects, like a 19th century colonial power. And I say straight away that I make a distinction between China and the Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party, a totalitarian party which is incapable of reform, either economically or politically, as so many scholars have pointed out, including Professor De Costa and Stanley Leeds. So Hong Kong was never in a position, unlike our other colonies, to be handed back independence and to create an autonomous democratic community. It was never in the same position as, say, Malaysia or Singapore or so many other places around the world. And that was because Hong Kong was created in two ways. First of all, it was the result of a grant, a permanent grant of part of Hong Kong as the settlement for the discredited and disgraceful Opium Wars. Secondly, so half of Hong Kong, including the island and the tip of the Kowloon Peninsula, were part of that grant. But the new territories, much more than half the landmass, where there were 7 cities built by the time we left, the new territories were possessed on a long lease, a 99-year lease, which had been signed in 1898, so ended in 1997. And much though some people would have liked things to have been different, there was no way we could avoid handing back Hong Kong to the People's Republic of China. Now, sometimes in China, as the Chinese Communist Party tries to rewrite history, it says that Hong Kong was never a British colony. It was never run by Britain as part of its colonial empire. It says it was an occupied territory. But it's an interesting own goal, as football commentators would say, because who occupied Hong Kong? Hong Kong was above all occupied by wave after wave of immigrants, of refugees from communism in China. And they had come because of the Great Famine, because of the Great Leap Forward, because of the Cultural Revolution. People like the now imprisoned Jimmy Lai, who'd stowed away on a ship. People clambered over razor wire. People swam through dangerous waters in order to get to, and this is such a moral embarrassment for the Chinese Communist Party, in order to escape communism and find a safe haven in a British colony. And that was a humiliation, I think, for the Communist Party. There were 2 difficulties when it came to the end of the lease in 1997. First of all, for Britain, it was very difficult to hand Hong Kong back in the way that we had dealt with and ended our sovereignty or our power in other places. When we tried to develop democracy rather more rapidly, Chinese communist leaders, including Zhou Enlai, said we shouldn't do that, because if we went too far down that road, people who lived in Hong Kong would think they were going to get independence as well, like Singapore or Malaysia. But that was never on the table. So we were probably almost certainly too slow in developing, alongside all the freedoms which you understand that create an open society. We were too slow in democratic development as well. We started, but we hadn't made as much progress as I've always believed we should have done. But we handed over a free society, an open society, and the Chinese Communist Party promised, as part of their side of the bargain, that Hong Kong's way of life and a substantial degree of autonomy would be retained for 50 years after 1997. And this was called One Country, Two Systems by Deng Xiaoping. Now, it's a slogan which you will know very well in Taiwan, because it was originally, almost certainly, developed in order to cover Beijing's relationship with Taiwan. One country, two systems. And we were promised in the joint declaration, which was a treaty lodged at the UN, and in a basic law, which was a reflection of the joint declaration, we were promised that Hong Kong would continue to be the same open society it always was. Now, that begs the question of whether the Chinese Communist Party ever really understands what a free society is like, ever really understands the rule of law. When I first tried to explain the rule of law to my opposite number in Beijing back in 1992, he said, "We have the rule of law." I said, "No, you have rule by laws." You make the laws, and everybody has to follow what the executive says. The rule of law applies to the executive as well. It applies to everybody in the society. It was also the case, I think, that they found it easy to make promises about the future of Hong Kong people, loosely assuming that they could continue to control developments in Hong Kong. Now, it's fair to say that for some time after 1997, after we left, the Beijing largely left Hong Kong on its own, largely left Hong Kong to continue more or less as it had been. What changed, I think, was the arrival of Xi Jinping in 2010, 2011, 2012. And I think that he regarded Hong Kong and all that it stands for, and the same, I guess, is true of the open society in Taiwan, as an existential threat to communist control. There is no example at all of the Chinese Communist Party really understanding what a reform, what changing its political system would be like. And this is where I think I can answer very easily your question. My main critic when I was governor of Hong Kong was a British diplomat who had once been British ambassador in Beijing. And he said to me, and he wrote this, he'd been in Beijing at the time of the Cultural Revolution when the British embassy was burnt down. And he said about the Chinese leadership, he said, they may be thuggish dictators, but they're men of their word. Now we know that the first part of that is true, but alas, the second part is not true. They're not men of their word. They break their word, they break their promises, and it's not just in relation to Hong Kong, it's elsewhere as well. So when I went to Hong Kong with this extraordinary and very different job of handing over a free society to a society that was not free, I thought it would be helpful if for the first time in my life, I kept a daily diary of what was happening. And when it came to the lockdown after COVID, the origins of which are still obfuscated largely by Chinese intransigence, communist intransigence, and communists locking up whistleblowers. When it came to lockdown, I'd always promised I would give my diaries to the main library in Oxford. And I said, well, I suppose I should look at them first. And when I started looking at them, and there were about 4 times as much as is actually published, when I started looking at them, I thought, there's no reason at all why I shouldn't publish these. And they make, particularly at the moment, when people are talking about whether we can trust China, they make a rather good story about the extent to which, unfortunately, you can't trust China. You could, to some extent, I think, under Deng Xiaoping, when things seem to be getting slightly easier in China, but certainly not after the crackdown that Xi Jinping has pushed through, worried that the Communist Party was starting to lose control. So that was the reason why I published them, and they give a daily account of what I was doing as governor, but also explain in some detail my relationship with Chinese negotiators. And they tried to explain my mood when I left Hong Kong, not being absolutely certain that Hong Kong would be able to stay as it had been so successfully. Hong Kong was a great international city, a great trading hub, a great example of how Asian cultures and Western cultures should combine to the benefit of everybody who lived in Hong Kong. And we've seen what's happened, of course. What I think the communists in Beijing want in Hong Kong is Hong Kong without Hong Kongers. So that's the reason for the diaries, which I'm pleased to say have sold very well and are still selling very well here. But that's not the real point. The real point is I wanted to point to make one thing very clear. Some people used to say that Hong Kong was the goose that laid the golden egg for China. I never believed that was a reason why the Chinese Communist Party would leave it alone, because inevitably, partly because of its trading relationship with Taiwan and the United States and others, China has become steadily richer, and Hong Kong, while remaining reasonably well off, has therefore, as a proportion of China's GDP, not meant as a great importance. When I left Hong Kong, Hong Kong was about 19% of China's GDP. It's gone down to probably 3% or thereabouts today. That's not because Hong Kong has been doing badly. It's because China has continued as the largest country, at least until recently in the world, to grow. But I never thought that the goose and the golden egg were the right metaphor for China and Hong Kong. I always thought the more important metaphor was another bird one, another avian metaphor, and that is the canary in the coal mine. As you know, there's a saying that they used to have a canary in the coal mine to tell whether the air was sufficiently good for people to go down and mine the coal. And I always thought that Hong Kong was a sort of canary in the mine for the Chinese Communist Party. It would tell us a lot about them, and it would tell us whether free societies could actually manage if China became too powerful or China started bossing them all around. So I hope that's a lesson that people can draw from the book, which tells the truth as I and many others saw it, and is in some ways an elegy for what Hong Kong was and what Hong Kong could still be if it wasn't under a pretty brutal police state regime today.
谢谢，谢谢哈。那我想请教总督的。
I have another question for you, Lord Patton, which is, you know that after the takeover by China very likely wouldn't keep its promise. But while you were a governor in Hong Kong, were you always suspicious that they wouldn't keep their word? And while during your time as a governor, did you try the hardest to promote the democratization in Hong Kong? Can you share with us what you think your contribution has been to the democratization in Hong Kong?
What happened while I was governor of Hong Kong was we made the existing electoral system for the legislature fairer than it had been, and without in any way changing the basic law or changing the joint declaration, because we try to keep our word, unlike the Chinese Communist Party. We made the system as democratic as possible and put in place elections which, when carried out in 1995, were wholly fair and provided a basis for going forward and making Hong Kong even more democratic. And one must not forget that at that period, the communist officials in the foreign ministry in Beijing and others closer to the ground in Hong Kong were promising that Hong Kongers would determine their own pace of democratization. They promised that Hong Kong would be able to continue to grow and become an ever more democratic society. So that was the promise that was made explicitly, not just implicitly, by the Chinese communists. And was I optimistic that that would continue to be the position? I suppose all of us are divided into pessimists and optimists. And it's said, I think, that one reason for being a pessimist is that you're sometimes mildly surprised and cheerful that things go better than you thought. And the problem of optimists is that when things become less good than you'd hoped they would be, you become much more miserable. I think I was somewhere between the two. My general feeling was that China would lose a great deal of credit around the world if it went back on its word with Hong Kong, with the rule of law, with open society, with freedom of the press, and with democratization, that it would lose a huge deal of credit around the world. That people would see that there was a point at which they simply could trust it. And I also thought that the Chinese have been so keen to negotiate and argue about every tiny bit of Hong Kong's governance, crossing every T and dotting every I. I thought to myself, well, they can't possibly have been so keen on all that detail if they were just going to walk away from it afterwards. And while I think it's true to say that for 10 years, maybe a little more, after 1997, they by and large kept their distance and they by and large let Hong Kong get on with things. They nevertheless choked every attempt to make it more democratic. And when Xi Jinping came in, with leaders who were terrified that the party was losing its control, that its grip on every aspect of civil society was beginning to slip, I think at that point they decided they had to crack down on Hong Kong as well. And it's worth remembering that the main demonstrations began with kids at school who were objecting to the communists trying to change the curriculum. And they then went on to the demonstrations over proposals for extradition, which produced, largely because of fears of how the Chinese communists would deal with that. I remember one supporter of Beijing saying, well, it would be a very good thing because it would mean that Beijing would no longer have to abduct people. There would be a legal process if we were going to get people back. The demonstrations then, which I think went up to about 2 million people, I mean, a huge proportion of the population of the 7 million or thereabouts population of Hong Kong, they weren't unpopular with the people of Hong Kong. You saw that in the subsequent elections for the district council, in which the pan-democrats won by a landslide. And it was that which I think triggered the alarm in Beijing that if things went on like that, sooner or later there would be a democratic majority, a substantial democratic majority in the Legislative Council. And that's when I think Xi Jinping and his acolytes decided they had to, in effect, run Hong Kong as a police state.
好，谢谢总督哈。那因为是
Thank you, Governor. In the interest of time, I would like to just follow up on one more question. And then I would like to leave this precious time to our audience here on site so they can have some exchange with you. And then at the end, we will give the floor to our panelists to give their comments and feedback to what you have just said. So the next question is that we often talk about a governor or a diplomat while they are dealing with the issue of governing or ruling Hong Kong. They also at the same time need to deal with the internal political changes in UK inside British. So during that negotiation period leading up to the handover in 1997, it was actually a stage of the liberalization of global economy. Therefore, in UK, many politicians or businessmen, they had maybe we can say unreasonable high expectation about China. They really wanted to do business with China. So according to your recollection and also in your diaries with regard to kind of political pressure of doing business with China, did that give you a lot of pressure and also pressure on your enforcement of your policies or influencing your negotiation about the handover of Hong Kong? Can you maybe give us a more detailed outline of your experience during that time? Thank you.
Well, business pressure, at least pressure from some businesses existed. Though, for example, many businesses were very supportive of what we were doing. the American Chamber of Commerce. Perhaps some will think it's rather a paradox, but they were strongly supportive of what we were doing. But there was, and it still exists today, a serious ignorance about how you do business with China. Some people say that you can only do business, you can only have an economic relationship or a trading relationship with China if you kowtow, if you accept the Chinese political narrative, and that the Chinese will bully you commercially if you ever cross them on political issues, and that they will, on the other hand, smile on your exports to them if you do what they want. If you take one example of that, and then I'm going to come to another in a moment. If you take one example of that, in the 5 years before I became governor, we had what was thought to be a very good relationship with Beijing. And British exports and trade was getting nowhere. It was plateauing or falling. In the 5 years when I was governor, when we had all these arguments, our trade was going up. It went up faster than that in any other OECD country. A point which I made in an earlier book and which I made in these diaries. So the one thing you couldn't do was to correlate your economic progress in doing business with China by looking at whether or not your political relationship with it was a good one. Anyway, that isn't, of course, what is supposed to happen. China's signed up to the WTO, and it can't accept the WTO's rights if it doesn't accept the WTO's obligations. But unfortunately, it doesn't see things that way. So it does politically interfere. And when you recall, for example, that the Australians in 2020 were incensed that the then Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi had been in Australia promising that this new outbreak of an illness in Wuhan was preventable and not transmissible, and it was all under control. At the same time, the Chinese were buying hand over fist PPE equipment from Australia, and as it happens, from Britain as well. So because of that, the Australians pressed for a proper WHO investigation, which was blocked at every turn and made more difficult at every turn by the Chinese communists. Meanwhile, I think Taiwan had a very clear idea of what was happening in Wuhan and the difficulties which the world was going to have to face. And there's a very good book by a Chinese novelist who wrote it under the pseudonym Mu Huang. He now lives in Australia. I think he's in exile because all his books were stopped in China by Xi Jinping and his Politburo. And that's called, I think, a Deadly Silent City. It's about Wuhan. So what happened when the Australians asked for that is that China said China said there'd be a blockade on Australian exports. But the truth is, first of all, that the Chinese buy what they need at the best price they can get. And Australia, in fact, produced lots of things that the Chinese really badly needed, like iron ore, like barley, and other things as well. So it's true that there were one or two parts of the Australian trade agenda with China which did badly, like wine and lobsters. But overall, Australia has done perfectly reasonably in its relationship with China, which doesn't justify the Chinese behavior, but it does underline the fact that politics isn't the only way you can do business with China, and that if the Chinese live up to their promises under the WTO, it should have no part commercial bullying of others. So I always took the view with businessmen who said, oh, we couldn't have another argument with China because it would make it impossible for them to export their goods. Well, what made it possible for them to export their goods was if China wanted them. And the other thing I would just say in passing is that we shouldn't think that China buying our goods is a sort of gesture of charity on their part. They buy our goods or invest in our countries because they want to make money. And if you look at the balance, the trade balance in the UK, for example, the Chinese Communist Party have a 40 billion trade surplus with us. So who's helping whom? In a 15-year period in the 1990s and just after, China's exports to the United States went up in that 15-year period by 1,600%. So who was doing favors to whom? If China really believes in that doing whatever they want is a zero-sum game in which everybody benefits, well, I say that if they left things to economics, it would be a zero-sum game. But if they start politicizing things, it becomes intolerable for the rest of the world, and they shouldn't be allowed to go on doing it. And businessmen should have the wit not to be conned by Chinese bullying in the way that often happens.
谢谢。那因为时间的关系，
Thank you. In the interest of time, I would like to ask our panelists, do you have any question? And then after that, we can quickly open the floor.
And Lord Patton, I'm very happy to see you here in the video. And I was born in Hong Kong, and I finished my primary and secondary education in Hong Kong. And during your regime, I was in Hong Kong finishing my last exam in the secondary schools. So I'm very happy to see you here, healthy, and I will regard you as the best governor I've ever seen in Hong Kong. I read your book, East and West, and also your book on the Hong Kong Diaries, and I'm very touched by your words and also by your writings. I have a few questions to ask you, okay? Not to mention one, okay? The first is that I think the UK, the United Kingdom, has been extended a helpful hands to the Hong Kongers by BNO visas and also by other treatments. I think more than 100,000 people have been migrated to the UK in the recent years. So I would extend a big thanks to my comrades and also to my friends who have migrated to the UK. But to what extent that the UK can help more on the situation of Hong Kong and also the Hong Kongers in the UK? I think this is something they are very concerned about their resident status, about also the people there in Hong Kong, and whether the UK and the international world can help more. The reason I ask this is because of the second question. I am thinking about the European Union and also G7 summit. Their conclusion is that they want de-risk without decoupling. I think hard about this concept. How can de-risk be realistic and materialized without decoupling? And the question is that when I look back about what the UK government has performed right now under Rishi's regime, is that first, they do not regard this as China as a threat, they regard this as a challenge only, and also they have some backtracked on a pledge to close down Confucius Institutes in the UK. And also when Jimmy Lai's son, Sebastian, and also Jimmy Lai's UK lawyers have cried out to help that the UK government should exert effective pressure on the CCP government. So in your own view, what can be done more to avoid the fallback or backlash into appeasement or semi-appeasement or even accommodations against the principles and values? And the last question is a $1 million question, which many youngsters have urged me to ask. They said about what if? What if Hong Kongers fought hard pre-1997 for sovereignty and independence? This is the question that they asked our older generation. Why you have not fought for your own country? And they said there's a critical moment after the 1989 June 4th massacre. If the people can have demonstrations and peaceful demonstrations in the streets to cry that we have joint declaration, but before basic law was born, it is pre-1990, if they fought hard to have their own sovereignty. And we know that without sovereignty, democracy will mean watery, if not none, and is unprotected. So what do you say about that? And also, when you reflect on the situation in Taiwan, what would you say about the semi kind of accommodations that we have not declared our country's independent status, but we are saying that we are de facto independent, while there will be no overlapping between PRC and ROC. And so to what extent and at what conditions would you say the one China policy adopted by the UK or the US would be changed? I think this is an extended question based on Hong Kong, because all through these years I thought hard. Because when we fight for democracy or freedom without fighting for or maintaining or struggling for sovereignty, it would be very dangerous, because Hong Kong showed you an example of how democracy is so fragile in a totalitarian state. Free society in unfree sovereign means it can be taken back by the totalitarian government very easily. So that's my reflections, and hope you can answer these three questions. Thank you.
好，谢谢。
Thank you.
Those are extremely important and profound questions, and I think I could probably best answer them by writing another book. But I'll try to be very brief. And first of all, saying that as far as Hong Kongers who've gone in exile from a city which they love, as a city which I loved, there are probably 140,000 or so who are in the UK over the last year or two. And of course, many others have gone to Australia and elsewhere. And they're already making a huge contribution. Teachers, lawyers, former civil servants, entrepreneurs, making a major contribution. My old school recently took on a new chemistry teacher. He just arrived from Hong Kong. I was in Oxford the other day and bumped into a couple from Hong Kong whose son had just graduated as a doctor and was applying for a job with the local health authority. So we are hugely benefiting from the presence of so many talented Hong Kongers in the UK. But Hong Kongers who leave Hong Kong, unfortunately, means that Hong Kong is not as vibrant and lively as it has been. And it underlines a point which I think I may have made earlier, that what the Chinese Communist Party wants is Hong Kong without Hong Kongers, which is, of course, an absurd proposition. You asked about de-risking or decoupling. And I often think that we get in diplomacy and politics into a terrible muddle when we just try to describe what we're doing with adjectives or nouns. De-risking, decoupling, strategic, competitor, threat. What really matters is the verbs. What really matters is what we do. And I think that is it de-risking or decoupling, if you're running a business, to be very concerned about your supply chain? Is it de-risking or coupling if running a business, you recall Xi Jinping demanding that the party cadres and the government cadres should involve themselves in an intense struggle against all the values of a free society? Is it de-risking or decoupling if you think to yourself as a businessman, well, how much do I want to actually invest or in a society which takes that view about a society in which I live in freedom? Is it de-risking or decoupling to look more carefully at supply chains and the export of high-tech equipment? I think all those are examples of the caution which we will inevitably display towards a society which has proved itself, or the communist regime has proved itself incapable of reform and is starting, even as it gets weaker in relation to others, because I think we're post-peak China. What if we have to take measures which safeguard our own interests? Is that de-risking or decoupling? I'm not in favor of us doing anything, and I wouldn't if I was in Taiwan, I think, which actually undermine my own national interest. But I'm certainly in favor of doing things which strengthen my national interest. For example, in the security field, by making it plain that we don't accept the threats that China makes continually about dominating the seas around its borders. I think we have to make it absolutely clear that we're not going to stand by if the Chinese government tries to stop ships using the Taiwan Strait. I mean, those are all fairly obvious examples, and I don't think I can call them either de-risking or decoupling. I think they're pursuit of the national interests of open and free societies. Now, we still have responsibilities as a reasonably important country. We're a member of the UN Security Council. We're not as big or important a country as we were. That's history, and that's what's happening in the world as a whole. But we should be in a position where, with a case like the Jimmy Lai case, Jimmy Lai is a British citizen. Only yesterday, I was talking to lawyers from the firm that has been pressing his case in the UK, and I wrote recently to the Foreign Secretary to ask on what occasions the British government had made direct representations to the Chinese about Jimmy Lai's case, and I had a letter about the several instances in which they'd done that, but not with any success. And one of the things that we've been pressing for with Jimmy Lai is consular access. We know why the Chinese Communist Party hates him. First of all, because he was a refugee from communism who was hugely successful in a free society. Secondly, because when they took over, he could have left before that or at any time with his money and lived somewhere else with a British passport. He could have, I'm sure, come to Taiwan or the United States, but he chose to stay because he's passionate about seeing Hong Kong survive as a free society. And what the communists hate above everything else is people who have the guts to stand up to them, is people who have the guts to stand up for what they believe in. Now, your $1 million question, I'm afraid I can answer very clearly. We could never argue for independence for Hong Kong after 1997 because we committed ourselves in a treaty going back years, but represented in the Joint Declaration to help prepare Hong Kong for a transfer of sovereignty to mainland China. I tell the story in my diaries about visiting a mental hospital during my time there. And one of the patients calling out to me, asking if he could ask me a question. And to the horror of my bodyguards and civil servants and doctors, I went over to answer the question. And he was a very civil guy, about my age, wearing a three-piece grey suit. And he said to me, Governor, he said, would you agree that Britain was probably the earliest democracy? So I said, yeah, I mean, you could argue that. I said, if you were blowing your own trumpet. So he said, would you agree that China is the last great communist tyranny? And I said, well, I wouldn't, of course, diplomatically say that, but I see what you're saying. And then he said, so could you explain to me why the earliest democracy is handing over to the last great communist tyranny? The people the free people of Hong Kong without ever asking what they think. And I said to my staff afterwards, there's a terrible irony in this. Here is the man with the sanest question in Hong Kong, who's in a mental asylum. I mean, it was quite a shock. But the truth is that we were committed always to the return of sovereignty of a place which had been a colony inhabited by people who were refugees from communism. That's the description of Hong Kong. Now, the last point you made was about Taiwan and One China. I'm not going to provoke anybody into suggesting that that doesn't reflect either history or current realities. I certainly wouldn't do that because it wouldn't be helpful for anybody in Taiwan for me to do that. It would be an intrusion into Taiwan's affairs and would be regarded by Chinese Communist Party as a red rag to a bull. All I will say is to repeat what I mentioned earlier. Taiwan is a democracy of 24 million people. Taiwan is a democracy of 24 million people, which recalls that the slogan, one country, two systems, was designed partially for Taiwan, maybe above all for Taiwan. And people in Taiwan can see what has happened to that promise in relation to Hong Kong. And that inevitably, I would guess, will have implications for people's attitudes to Taiwan. How couldn't it have? So I repeat that when I'm told by people who talk about Asian values, that democracy and the rule of law and the free media are inconsistent with the values of a Confucian society, I say, look at Taiwan. That's a Confucian society which is robustiously democratic, in which people have arguments, in which they have a free press, in which they can elect their government, in which they can throw out a president or a government they don't like. Does that happen in China? Will it ever happen in China? Maybe one day, probably not in my lifetime. But I do not for one moment believe that any dictatorship ends well. If anybody can give me an example of a dictatorship which ended well, I'd like to know what it is. So I'm optimistic about the values which represent Taiwan's contribution to the world, the values which so many people in Hong Kong have believed in. I'm confident that those values will survive. Nelson Mandela said you can't lock up an idea, and that's the best idea about how to govern a society, combining economic freedom and political freedom that I know about. Would TSMC have been possible? Would your extraordinarily technical progress have been possible in an entirely totalitarian state? I rather doubt it. Would your education system have been as good in a totalitarian state? I rather doubt that. So I do think that there are certain things about every free society which will endure forever.
好，谢谢。那总督在我们
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for a. Before I thank you for the perfect hour you've given us, can we give the room for one question? Sorry, you may go.
Can I say, because I've taken so long to answer questions, I can go for another 20, 25 minutes if you want, if there are still some questions, because you have to live with challenges and I'm sure anxieties, which you deserve to be able to talk about. So if you want to go on for another 20 minutes, I'm happy to do that.
非常感谢爵士的，是不是我们大家
Thank you so much. Can we give a round of applause to our Lord Patton for his kindness he shows to Taiwan? Now we give the floor to Ping Lu.
Politics is not a popularity contest, but you are really, really super popular. I was starting work in Hong Kong starting 2003. It's already 6-7 years. after you left, okay? But people always love you and call you Fei Peng, and and they all know your favorite egg tart place, the Chang Ta. They really love you from the bottom of their heart. Of course, this kind of popularity also adds some pressure to the Dong Jianhua, to Zheng Yunquan, to CY, of course, and also to even now. Okay. My question is, apart from that, you mentioned a word, slow, earlier. You said probably something happened too slow. And my question is that when your government, the colonial government, left Hong Kong, when the clock ticked on and on, in preparation of all the hardware and software, of preparation of giving Hong Kong people some political, all kind of abilities for the future. And people mention that the colonial government, I mean, even before 1992, made a decision to give power to the bureaucrats you trust, the civil servants. Give to the bureaucrats instead of giving to all the, say, pro-democratic camp politicians. I think that's probably a decision your government made. What do you think of that decision nowadays, if seeing retrospectively?
Okay. First of all, can I just go back to something I said earlier when you asked about independence for Hong Kong? And I just tell you one story. In 2016, I was back in Hong Kong talking about another book I'd written. And while I was there, I spoke in the Foreign Correspondents Club. And I said then that I would always support calls for greater democracy in Hong Kong, but I couldn't possibly support the arguments for Hong Kong becoming independent. And I explained why, for the same reasons that I put earlier about it being a breach of our obligations under the treaty. And I also said that if you went on saying that, you'd play into the hands of the hardliners in the Communist Party. One of the leaders of the students said, well, you've said that in the Foreign Correspondents Club, and they all clapped you. Would you come and say that to students? And I went along to the main hall in Hong Kong University. There were students from every university there. And I spoke to them, and I didn't convince them all. I mean, they were very civil. They asked tough questions. And one of them at the end said to me, okay, so if we go along with what you're saying, what happens if in time the Chinese Communist Party cracks down on us, is tougher and with us? What will you do? And to be honest, I gave a rather politician's answer, because it was very difficult. I wasn't going to be able to say we'd send in a gunboat. That's the 19th century. So I was able to say, well, we'd call it out. We'd try to shine a light on what was happening in Hong Kong. And all that is true. But at the end of the day, if the Chinese Communist Party appears to, or behaves appallingly, as it is at the moment, with the person running Hong Kong being a complete quisling, there because he was a tough policeman in dealing with demonstrations. There are limits to what one can do, but it does shape your attitude to the extent to which you can trust China on big issues in the future. Secondly, your own question. My view, which is clear in the book, I think, in the diaries, is that we should have done more after the joint declaration to speed up the democratization process in Hong Kong, to make the electoral system even more fair by increasing the number of directly elected seats. We did that at the margins, but the main change I made was to increase the suffrage in functional constituencies, which probably introduced about another 2 million people to democracy. But I think we should have done more in the 1980s. It might have made little difference, but it would have made some difference. And we had a consultation exercise in the 1980s, asking people whether they wanted a faster pace for introducing directly elected seats. And extraordinarily, apparently, the outcome of that was that they didn't. They were happy with the present number. And there have been lots of questions asked, not unreasonably, about the integrity of that process. And I much sympathize with those arguments. So I think we could have done more from the time of the joint declaration. I think before that, the point does stand that I made earlier, that the Chinese Communist Party kept on saying, including people who were regarded as moderate leaders like Zhou Enlai. I slightly doubt the use of the word moderate, let me say, charming and intelligent, but not moderate. But the fact is that Beijing did endlessly say, if you introduce as much democracy as people in Hong Kong want, they'll think they're going to have independence. And that's not an option. And that was quite a difficult argument to contest. Sometimes I think it was probably used as a cover for not doing more. But there was a certain political and intellectual force to the argument. And I think that probably explains why more wasn't done in the 1960s and 70s. On the civil service point, what we did have was, to be honest, the best civil service I've ever worked with. I don't want to give any of them more difficulties than they've got already, but some of them were the best civil servants I've ever had. Ansem Chan was the best woman I've ever worked with. I mean, she was outstandingly good and would have got to the top in any system in the world because of her, among other things, because she told the boss what she thought. And there's a passage in the Analects in which the master is asked, what's the worst thing that can happen to a leader? And he says, I'm editing it heavily. He says, in effect, the worst thing that can happen is if a leader has advisors who tell them what he wants to hear rather than what the truth is. And I think that's true in every system. And probably one of the fundamental weaknesses in the present Communist Party system, alongside the terrible demographic problems, the fact that, as Wen Jiabao said 15 years ago, the economic model is unsustainable. Another real weakness today is that Xi Jinping is surrounded by yes men. No yes women, because of course women can't get on under the Communist Party. It's only in a free society like Taiwan that they can get to the top.
Thank you. 我们因为时间的关系。
In the interest of time, so maybe we can take two final questions. Maybe I would like to ask Dr. Lai to raise his question, and the one final question we can leave it to our audience here on the floor.
First of all, I was not born in Hong Kong. Neither did I have any living experience in Hong Kong. So the questions I like to raise to you are basically more general. The first one is about the geopolitical environment that you operate while you were in the you were governor in Hong Kong. At that time, that from 1992 to 1997, we believe that China was still trying to get back to the international society after the June 4th massacres, and the world also at that time was entering the post-Cold War era. The globalization was about to rise, but not yet reach its peak. So how those environments helps you or limits your ability to deal with the Chinese authority in the transitions. So that's the first general question. And second is more Taiwan-centered. In Taiwan, while your time in Hong Kong, that's also the period that Taiwan is about to form its China policy right after the Cold War era. And at that time that we continued to hear the argument like this, that is, the Chinese authority was very careful about the negative consequence of the ruling Hong Kong, how that will bring about the dissatisfaction among Taiwanese people regarding the Chinese model of the one country, two system. So that, they argue, the Chinese, the management about Hong Kong will be always take the Taiwan factor into account, and that they would not go overboard. They would not go to the extent that the Hong Kong just cannot tolerate. But then I think that in year 2003, right after the SARS, the Hong Kong came out with the 500,000 protests right there, and there are also series of the other the protests from Hong Kong toward the Chinese authority. So at least, first of all, from 1992 to 1997, during your 5 years as a governor there, do you detect anything that the Taiwan factor actually factor into the Chinese authority in dealing with the Hong Kong in the transition period that you were there? Yeah, those two questions.
Thank you. Sir.
Okay, let me deal with the first one. And then I'll come to Taiwan. On the first one, I think there was always a rather comfortable delusion in the West, which was rather Marxist in its intellectual origin, that economic and technical change would inevitably lead to political change. So that sooner or later, China's economic progress, which is now, of course, stalled, would produce political change. I always thought that was a shade hopeful. I didn't think it was intellectually entirely coherent. So I never really believed that sooner or later Hong Kong would have more influence on the way China was governed than the other way around, because there's a David and Goliath situation there, for example. Beijing communists can lock up democracy campaigners in Hong Kong, and does. Hong Kong democracy campaigners can't lock up Politburo members in Beijing. And the best example of that delusion was given by one of our rather good former prime ministers, Tony Blair, who said when China signed the WTO, he said, and I'm quoting him, "China's road to democracy is now unstoppable." Well, it seems to have stopped. And I think what we forget is a sentence from the extremely wise long telegram written by an American diplomat called George Kennan in 1946 about the Soviet Union. And what I'm going to say isn't an argument for trying to reprise the Cold War. It is just a reflection of a very wise remark said then, which applied to the Soviet Union, and is now, I think, relevant to China. And Kennan said, their idea of practicalities, their idea of what's possible, their idea of what's in the world, what's desirable in the world, and ours are incompatible. And I think that what the Chinese Communist Party stands for is incompatible with what in Taiwan you believe in, what in Britain we believe in, what in Europe we believe in, what in America, whatever our imperfections, and they exist. We tell people about what our values are, and unfortunately, we don't always live up to them. We're prepared to fight for them, but we don't always live up to them. And so I do think that it was always kidding ourselves that somehow, inevitably, China would become a democracy. I think that China was opening up for the first 10 years of the century, but I think that was closed down when Xi Jinping took over, partly because the Chinese leadership was spooked by the political ambitions of Bo Xilai, partly because I think there was a real sense that they were losing control over civil society, east, west, south, north. They were no longer obviously in control. And I think Xi Jinping, well, just one other thought about that. People sometimes think I exaggerate, but there was a very close, he maybe still is, Wang Qishan, who was a very close advisor to Xi Jinping, who became obsessively interested. We saw it when he came to Oxford on a visit once with Alexis de Tocqueville, a French political philosopher who I had to study at university. And de Tocqueville was hugely interesting, not only about democracy in America, but about the Ancien regime in France and the French Revolution. And two of the conclusions that he drew in the 18th century were that people didn't become easier to govern simply because they were becoming better off. Indeed, quite the reverse. Ideas of inequity started to develop more strongly. And secondly, de Tocqueville argued that every authoritarian, every totalitarian society is most vulnerable when it tries to change or reform. And I think Wang Qishan and other leaders regarded that as a real warning. And it's interesting, if you look back at that period 10, 12 years ago, the sales of de Tocqueville's book, The Ancien Regime and the French Revolution, in China spiked. And it became a compulsory book to read at the Communist Party school, Central Party school. So I think that we deluded ourselves about that point about the inevitability of economics producing political change. And I think that wishful thinking is not a very good guide to political behavior. So did the question of the commitments made to Taiwan implicitly about one country, two systems show have much of a place in China's attitude when I was there to Hong Kong? I think it was always what literary scholars might call a subtext. I think we were always aware of the fact that Deng Xiaoping hadn't produced this mantra principally for Hong Kong, but thought it applied to Hong Kong in a very comfortable way. And I don't think that Chinese officials ever really thought to themselves, what will Taiwan think about it if we show that we can't stand any sign of the rule of law or freedom of press or democratization in Hong Kong? What will Taiwan think? I don't think there was very much sign that that was thought about. And that may make you wonder how sophisticated the leadership in Beijing really is. People often talk about it as though it's all wise. Not at all. and they produce stories that suggest that this or that bit of political wisdom was actually coined by China or the Chinese Communist Party. So perhaps the best example of that is when, was it Zhou Enlai or Mao Zedong who was reported of having said to Kissinger and Nixon when asked about the French Revolution and its effects, said it's too soon to tell. And people afterwards said, oh, it just shows he's taking the long view. The interpreter pointed out that he was actually talking about the demonstrations in Paris in 1968, not about 1789. But it was comfortable for us to think that somehow there was this extraordinary wisdom being shown by a totalitarian leader. The greatest wisdom people have to show is when they put themselves and their views in front of people who are free to vote for whatever they want. That requires real wisdom. That requires real intellectual courage, and that requires and that involves being able to take the toughest decisions because you're carrying a society with you, not by threatening to lock people up if they don't agree with you.
非常谢谢。我们是不是用
Thank you so much. With a round of applause, we would like to thank Lord Patton. I don't know if there are anyone here today who would like to ask our Lord Patton a question. I think we have a question here. We'll give the microphone to this lady.
I'm the reporter, and I have one question to ask. The Hong Kong Diaries was published a year ago. It mentioned that Hong Kong people commemorate June 4 every year. The CCP may be able to clean up Black history, but it is absolutely impossible in Hong Kong. And you said burn books and bury Confucian scholars alive will not happen in Hong Kong, but actually it's happened in this year. So may I ask that how do you evaluate Hong Kong in this year? Thank you.
First of all, a question about history. For any totalitarian regime, history is an insurrectionary subject because inevitably it challenges your own account of events. And it's not a surprise, therefore, that one of the first things that the Communist Party have done in clamping down in Hong Kong is to stop the vigil every year on the 4th of June, remembering the dead kids, the people who were squashed under the tracks of tanks or shot in 1989. One of the most depressing things was that I think it was last year, there were still masses being said in Catholic churches and perhaps similar religious events in other churches in memory of the people who were murdered in Tiananmen. And the police were photographing people coming out of church. And I wondered, I hope I'm wrong, whether it was nervousness about Chinese political attacks on organized religion, which encouraged some churches to be rather reluctant to speak out about history or about what's presently happening in Hong Kong. I think the Vatican, as I've said, is rather excessively optimistic about its ability to do a deal with the Chinese Communist Party and bringing the underground church and the political church, the patriotic church, together. I think it's been rather less sophisticated than the Vatican usually is in its foreign policies, but I hope I'm wrong. I'm aware of the fact that there is a large Christian community in Taiwan, large Catholic community in Taiwan, who will, I'm sure, themselves have been going to Mass last week and to remember the people murdered in Tiananmen. Where does Hong Kong, you said, stand today? Well, Hong Kong today is being drained of its intellectual vitality, drained of many of its people, because of what is, in effect, the establishment of a police state. And I don't criticize people at all who say, well, you know, things may have gone pretty badly in that sense. We still have to earn our living, and we still love the walks in the new territories and the excitement of living in a great Asian city like Hong Kong. So we stay. And I don't criticize necessarily those expatriates who say there's nothing wrong here, even though 200,000 of them have left. There's nothing wrong here, who've got foreign passports in their back pocket and are earning a pretty good living. What I do find pretty objectionable are people for whom it's expedient to say things that they know aren't true. And that recently at Easter in the Catholic Church, you listened to a gospel reading about Pontius Pilate. I was reminded about this by reading a great essay by I think the best translator of the Analects of Confucius, whose nom de plume was Simon Lees, who's really a Belgian-Australian called Pierre Reichman. And Simon Lees points out that in the gospel account of probably the most famous trial in history, the carpenter from Galilee, who is hauled by the Sanhedrin, the chief rabbi, before Pontius Pilate, and they tell the Pontius Pilate that this man's a rebel and is planning a rebellion against the Romans. And Pontius Pilate is very nervous about his position because he's been criticized already in Rome for being weak about 2 uprisings in Judea. And Pontius Pilate plays for time. And he starts asking Jesus questions. And he says, half in jest, when Jesus says that, in response to a question about who he is, has said, I'm the way and the truth. And Pontius Pilate says, in Latin says, Quod est veritas? What is the truth? He knows perfectly well what the truth is. But it's not expedient for him to tell it, to say that this carpenter for Galilee isn't a rebel. You may think he's got odd ideas, but he's not a rebel. But it's not expedient for him to say that. And I think there are too many people in Hong Kong and who do business with China for whom it's not expedient for them to say what is clear to all of us. And what is clear to all of us is China is trying to turn Hong Kong into a police state. It's just another bit of China. It's not a bit of China in which the leadership will find it as comfortable to invest as they once did. So they're now putting their money into Singapore. You look at the number of family firms which have been springing up in Singapore to manage people's investments. So I salute all those who, whether it's expedient or not, are prepared to speak up for free speech, for right of assembly, for the right to choose your own government, and to get rid of your own government if you don't like it. And I hope those views will continue to animate as many people in Hong Kong in the future as they have in the past.
Amen. 谢谢总督，是不是让我们在场的贵宾用最热烈的掌声
Thank you very much. A round of applause. We would like to thank Lord Patton for your time. We hope that your integrity and your wisdom can continue to shine the way for Hong Kong. We would like to thank you for giving us this time, even though we are over the hour that we have promised you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's been a great privilege of me to try to answer your questions. And I wish you all the best of good fortune and to assure you that there are many people, I'm sure it's being reflected today in the conversations between our own Prime Minister, Mr. Sunak, and President Biden. A lot of people are thinking about you today, perhaps thinking about you more than they would have done in the past. So thank you. And thank you for being a beacon of democracy in Asia.
好，谢谢谢谢。那我们跟大家跟这个彭亮。
Thank you. Can we all wave goodbye to Lord Patton?
好，谢谢哈。那我们在场的所有的这个贵宾哈，因为今天实在是我们也考量他的这个身体啦哈，因为已经也79岁了哈。那他今天也非常的这个我觉得他是越谈越起劲。那他也是这个心中有非常多的感触哈，想要跟我们大家分享。我想这本。
So I think this publication is really worth reading, and I would like to thank our panelists Sangpu, Pinglu, and Dr. Lai for joining us for this conversation with Lord Patton. And I think you are all old friends with him, and it's really to our pleasure to be able to see him online. And we actually have some lessons from the development of Hong Kong. Our audience here are very concerned about the future of both Hong Kong and Taiwan. And is there anything we can do for Hong Kong in the future is something that, of course, we will continue to do. And again, I would like to promote this book for our publisher, which is which offers rich information. Again, I would like to congratulate our chief editor for arranging these panel discussion. And of course, there were ups and downs. So as the president of Taiwan think tank, we are allies in this fight. Again, thank you to our audience for attending this online talk. And I wish you a great day.